This next one, sent to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Jeff in upstate New York. Dear Jim, you've often criticized Vince McMahon, and rightly so, for often presenting sizzle instead of steak. That being said, in your opinion, to what degree does a show's look, feel, and presentation matter? To me, Mid-South after leaving Shreveport, world class with the Renegades Rampage ring, WWF tapings post-Allentown, JCP becoming WCW, Chip Kessler instead of Bob Caudle on Smoky Mountain. All changes that had nothing to do with wrestlers or in-ring action, but changes that left me missing the way things were. I realize that I may be the only person on earth who misses Joe McHugh and Reeser Bowden, but I really would love to hear your thoughts on how important a show's look, feel, and presentation are.
Well, you've covered a couple different things there, though with look and feel and presentation, an announcer is obviously involved in that, but when you're talking about two different things when you're talking about personnel changes and production changes. And the look and feel of the program in terms of the lighting and the environment in wrestling, it didn't used to be particularly important at all. I mean, because we've talked about in the 50s, people have seen the old 50s wrestling tapes that still exist, and it was black and white, and it was simple. But that's what TV looked like. Boxing and football, everything looked the same way. That was the state of the art at the time. Then in the territory days, it was local television. And I mean, then it was a crapshoot as to what you were going to look like. And the bigger television stations had a better looking studio wrestling product. The Memphis show always looked good because WHBQ and later WMC, they were two of the better stations in the market, and they had nice studios. Then Nick Goulas at the same time on the other end of the territory. We used to get a tape from Huntsville, Alabama. The Huntsville TV every now and then was Sterling Brewer. And when the interns and Ken Ramey were on it, the interns are dressed in white. One guy take them and shoot one of them across the ring, and he would leave a streak of white all the way across the TV screen from the goddamn bleeding of the, white outfit and the low production quality. But that was local television at the time. And people understood that, and they still watched it because it was the content of the show that mattered. And yes, all the changes that the questioner mentioned, the Renegades Rampage logo on the mat was after the glory days of USWA / that brief period of world class there. It wasn't so much some of the for instances that he gave weren't so much about the difference in the look of the TV show as much as the fact that they had lost key personnel, lost key talent, business was down. The crowd wasn't what it used to be. When you were watching studio wrestling, you understood there were almost no people there. It was 50 or 75 or 100, depending on the studio. But still, if they were making noise, it helped. But when wrestling moved to the arenas, and when Vince started, his national expansion and started putting way more money into the sizzle than the steak, and it wasn't about who was on the talent roster. It wasn't about who the announcers were. It was just the television show looked better. It looked more major league. It was more visually appealing to the average person who may not even be a regular wrestling fan, but would look at something like, oh gosh, those guys are stars, and wow, they're in a big arena and it's all lit up and a blah, blah, blah. And then that's when the promoter started playing catch up with production quality and production value and trying not to look like the B team or the B movie studio. Even until the early 90s, really. I mean, it first started in the 80s with WCW and WWF, battling it out. but people were still watching the territories shows until they went away. And even Smoky Mountain Wrestling in the early 90s, obviously we weren't a national production, but for what else was airing in terms of local television, in terms of regional sports on the stations that we were on in the states we were in, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, we were still comparable looking to television that was, just shot for that area and better than many. Not just wrestling, but television. But then, over the past, however, but 20, 25 years, with the dawn of the digital age and everything, now you can do an incredible digital video picture with your goddamn cell phone on a stick. So even though production is still important, AEW looks close enough to WWE that if the content of the show and the roster and the booking and the interest and the energy of what the content was better, it would be, close enough that you could say, well, fuck this, these guys are pretty close. It's not local television, but the local aspect of it is what is hard to get off the ground these days with wrestling for a variety of reasons, including it's hard to get a good looking building, a decent crowd, a roster of good wrestlers that are booked in an entertaining way, and to shoot the whole thing with an experienced TV crew to where it looks comparable. That ain't as easy as it used to be. The whole TV world has changed. So production has gone from not really important at all to, it's good when you have it in the 70s and 80s, to now a lot of it is, half the battle.
Well, again, to go to his question and talking about the presentation, let's look at Memphis just because you know that better than anyone. There's a few things that happened throughout the years that I actually think, as a fan of it, hurt the product. Obviously, Lance Russell leaving the show, as good as Dave Brown was, hurt because it was Lance Russell and it was that show. So even if the show was still great and the angles were still great and you like the wrestling, whatever it is, it changed the feeling of the show. But also, and I may be alone on this or in the minority, when they got rid of the curtains as the backdrop and they went to the little set for the for the CWA, and then after that, remember in the early 90s, they even had like a green screen and Dave would interview guys in front of a green screen while an image was in the background. Like things like that, actually.
And then when we went back, me and Stan and Steve, the fabulous ones, in early 91, they had a sponsorship deal with one of the strip clubs in town, so they'd have the strippers in bikinis standing up there when they did the Memphis card. And then, and I could just imagine if Christine Jarrett had seen that back in the days, go, why are they making our television show look like a strippers?
It's every time Stan and Steve are in town.
Well, no, this was what they were. Actually, this is the way I got heat. They were doing, the strippers would come out for every time you talked about the local card, and they would stand there. And I'm sure Dave Brown's not a stripper aficionado. He probably wasn't real fond of it either. But I come out with Stan and Steve, and I said, wait a minute. We've just come back. We just turned on Jerry Lawler. We're doing a hot angle for the main event. And we're going to stand in front of a bunch of twats wearing bikinis. That's all people are going to be fucking staring at. I told the girls, I said, get off this stage. I know you want my fabulous ones, and we're not going to say a word until you leave. Well, they didn't have any idea who the fuck I was or anything about wrestling. They just been paid to stand there with the tickets out. So they're not going to do it. And I looked at Dave, and I told him, and I gave him the eye where he knew. I said, Dave Brown, ain't going to be another word spoken out here until those girls get off this set. And that's when he turned around and said, all right, ladies, just go ahead on and let's humor him to see what he has to say. And he ran them off. And then I got heat from the people for running off the strippers with the big tickets. But anyway, yes. That's
what about the curtain? What about them losing the curtain in Memphis on TV?
Well, they didn't lose it.
Well, you know what I mean.
Where it was, they just changed. They were trying to upgrade the look of the show and make it look more contemporary. And they had a set built, with the big logo and everything. But at the same time as that happened, the talent took a massive nosedive. And because the territories were dwindling and the talent was starting to be sucked up by the big companies with guaranteed contracts, and the whole thing was changing. So the point is, you can have the best produced television show in the world, and think back to, was that Paul Alperstein that did the AWF, or Herb Abrams' UWF? For the time, that was a major league looking television production that you would have thought they spent some money in, except they had 500 people in a 15,000 seat building. But the production meant nothing because the content of the show was dreck. And in some cases, there in the late 80s, all the shows were trying to find sponsors or trying to change their look or upgrade something that they could afford to upgrade, but they'd lost talent. They'd lost announcers. They'd lost key people. That's what you can't fabricate or replicate. And I'm just saying, traditionally, territory wrestling, some of these territories did ludicrous business on some of the worst looking television productions that you've ever seen. We put the 23,000 people in the Superdome for the last Stampede match with Watts and JYD. The go-home interview with Junkyard Dog as Stagger Lee was shot on a VHS camera out in a fucking field with no windscreen on the camera, and it was a windy day, or on the microphone.
And they blindfolded Jim Ross.
And Jim Ross being blindfolded so he couldn't go back and tell people where Stagger Lee's hideout was. But nevertheless, the production meant nothing. It was the content, the personalities, and the people selling it on camera. And then Vince made production important. And then at the same time, people lost their talent. I still say, all things considered, the talent and the content of the program is way more important than the production to wrestling fans, and they will find the program they like, if there is indeed one out there that exists. But today you do have to have some level of production to clear some type of bar before people will even look at it and give it a chance, just because production in general has come so far.
Well, when we talk about the presentation and the commentators, is there any evidence that shows that commentators yelling at the audience for the entire show is an effective way to get a message across?
No, and especially, and a lot of people are even going to say, well, Cornette, you were goddamn having a fucking epileptic seizure when you did commentary, especially in OVW. But I had Dean Hill next to me to balance me out. It was like a human soma. No, that was Dean's thing, to be laid back and to talk when I breathed. But I was selling like an auctioneer to get the point across. But when they're screaming for the sake of screaming, and the fake announcer voice, and you can tell that it's not really genuinely coming from what's in the ring or what they feel, but it's just their notes and or the things they've been told to sell, and it's constant. You know, that's just become a thing because everybody imitates the WWF. And people that wanted to be wrestling announcers were imitating Gene Okerlund or Vince McMahon 30 years ago, and now, well, they still are. I mean, what is Sockface on AEW? He's doing that fake announcer.
Oh.
Well, besides that. But, I mean, he's doing that fake announcer voice, and he's doing the mark announcing that he'd used to do in the basement and making sure to call every single obscure Japanese move by its correct name while getting nobody over to a regular audience of normal people.
I also laughed during the angles.
Yes. And so that's been a thing since, Gene Okerlund had that personality. He was the exception to the rule. You could get away with that because he was just that. He was dry and it worked, but everybody tries to imitate him or anything else that anybody's ever done. It just comes off that way it's like, when I was fucking 17 and, who am I going to imitate? I'm going to imitate handsome Jimmy Valiant. Woo, must say promises, baby. But I didn't look anything like him and everybody knew I was imitating him. And that's the thing is it's just a lot of imitation, which is not necessarily the sincerest form of flattery these days.